200 feet below the waves, Tom Pritchard had a job to do. One of the main mooring lines attached to the famed wreck, the Andrea Doria, had come loose, and Pritchard, 64-year-old man, was tasked with venturing down with two other crew members from the dive boat called the John Jack to secure it. Being a seasoned scuba diver, with the experience and the certification necessary to make the challenging dive to one of the world's most alluring shipwrecks, Pritchard was the man for the job. After the three men successfully attached the line, they each had a few minutes to explore the wreckage before having to ascend. About an hour and 15 minutes later, after making several decompression stops, first of three crew members, Sean Sweeney, arrived at the surface. 15 minutes later, the next crew member, Terry Martzel, surfaced. Hanging up his gear before climbing onto the stern, he looked around for the final member of the group, Tom Pritchard. Tom, being the bearded, jovial, retired college professor known on board as Doc, should have surfaced just before Martzel, but wasn't anywhere to be seen. Nate Garrett, an experienced diver and instructor who paid to be on his long-awaited first trip to the Andrea Doria, shouted out to Jack, "Hey, Doc was supposed to come up. Where is he?" The Italian luxury liner named the Andrea Doria sank in July of 1956 after colliding with the MS Stockholm in what became an infamous maritime disaster. Of the 1,700 passengers and crew on board, only 50 people were killed, and though the Doria has been lying on her starboard side on the ocean floor ever since, her death toll was far from finished. In the 59 years since the Doria went down, more than 15 divers have died attempting to reach the wreck. They've either gotten lost in the ship's collapsing compartments, fallen prey to faulty, unchecked equipment, or perished by one of the many other possible ways to die being underneath 200 feet of water. Although racking up a hefty death toll, the Doria's popularity in the diving community never died down. Lying 250 feet under cold, dark water, the Doria has become a measuring stick by which the world's best divers compare themselves. Divers train for years to gain enough experience and spend thousands on equipment and custom gas mixtures that allow them to dive far below the limits of recreational scuba divers. When divers make it to the bottom to see the Doria, they can simply swim over the top to take in the views, or they can go inside, which many will in search of treasure. The site owner doesn't confiscate any found treasures, therefore divers are always looking for their own piece of history. Old china from the well-appointed cruise liner is the most common take-home item of fame, and every now and then someone gets lucky. The biggest discovery was in 2010, when two divers from New Jersey found a 75-pound bell that once sat atop the Doria's deck. Tom Pritchard took up diving late in life, first doing it in 2001 on a family vacation in Australia, only aiming to have some fun with his family, but he was instantly hooked. He thought it would be cool to go scuba diving one day, said his son, Michael Pritchard. Once he got going, I guess he just got the bug. As he advanced through recreational diving and into what's known as technical diving, he pursued more challenging goals, traveling the eastern seaboard of the US and eventually visited the Doria several times. But Pritchard, who was a professor of neuroscience at Penn State Hershey College of Medicine until his retirement in 2014, was no daredevil. He wasn't chasing the danger of the Doria or anything like that, his son said. He was very conscious of the safety risks. He was meticulous about his gear and his equipment. Pritchard, with about 1,000 dives under his belt, had a reputation for careful preparation and attention to detail. 2 days before the fateful dive, Pritchard and a diving buddy drove the 6 hours from Pennsylvania to Rhode Island, where the John Jack had been chartered by Sharkey's Underwater Expedition, a Missouri-based diving outfit. Pritchard was on board as a part of the John Jack's crew, intending to work and dive on the back-to-back Doria trips. However, on that Monday, after a very bumpy and rocky ride out to the Doria's site, Pritchard wasn't feeling up to the challenging dive. Having not gotten enough sleep and feeling way under 100%, he would not dive that day. Being the cautious and experienced diver, only helped others ready their equipment and seal up their suits, while staying on board for the main dive of the day. But by Tuesday morning, Pritchard seemed to have found his sea legs. Having a very talkative morning with the crew, trading stories back and forth, it was time to get to work. Over the course of Monday night, the main line, tethering the John Jack to the Andrea Doria, was disconnected and needed to be resecured. Calling on the experienced Pritchard, he suited up. He was equipped that day with a rebreather on his back, a dry suit covering his body, and multiple tanks filled with various compressed gas strapped to his back and under his arms. For the last time, Tom Pritchard sank below the waves. For a skilled diver like Pritchard, the swim down to the Andrea Doria is fairly straightforward. After submerging into the water, he would have held on to the secondary fixed line attached to the wreck below and allowed himself to sink. Only having adjustments to his rebreather, there would have been very little to do on the roughly 4-minute journey down. At about 200 feet below the surface, the amount of oxygen in the air we breathe on land becomes toxic under pressure. Through the rebreather's controls, divers switch to a gas mixture that won't knock them out or send them into convulsions. Substituting some of the oxygen and nitrogen in the air for helium, the resulting mix of these three gases is called a trimix. As you go further down towards the Doria, the water goes from a green to a gray until it's nearly all black, and that is where the wreck sits. Having lights on their knees and hands, divers greet the Doria with all fours facing forward. After all this preparation and journey downward, divers only have a few minutes to explore the Doria before having to start the return. The more time divers spend breathing the specially tailored mix of gases required to survive at such depths, the longer they'll have to spend making their way back to the surface. A typical Doria dive will usually only feature about 15 or 16 minutes of exploring the wreck before divers must leave. Before leaving the main line, divers affix a strobe light to help them find their way back. They will also hook lines of their own from the main line to the ship so they can find their way back when their time in the wreck runs out. Every minute at this depth increases decompression time dramatically. For a dive of typical duration, the return to the surface requires about an hour of stops, having them nearly every 10 feet, pausing for precisely timed intervals. If these stops aren't taken, the gases inhaled and absorbed at the pressurized environment far below the surface can bubble in the diver's blood like a soda can when the pressure around them starts to decrease on the ascent. The stops allow for the body to acclimate, off-gassing the helium and nitrogen safely while breathing in an increasingly oxygen-rich mix. Foot by foot, divers make their way towards the surface, while always keeping a grip on the line that keeps them connected to it. Back on board the John Jack, it took only moments for the crew to realize that Pritchard had vanished. Martzel said he thought he'd seen Pritchard at the 20-foot decompression stop just a few minutes before. He went on to say he had signaled to him and he headed to the boat. Martzel frantically got his suit back on and plunged into the water to look for his friend below the boat. When there was no sign of Pritchard below, someone radioed the Coast Guard. The captain said they started throwing garbage overboard as a clever way to track the current and to give the Coast Guard rescue crews a trail to follow in case Pritchard was bobbing on the surface downstream. Within about 10 minutes, a Coast Guard plane was overhead. Visibility was at a mile, they reported, while also saying if he had surfaced behind the boat, we would have seen him. Down below the surface at the Doria, the handful of remaining divers were unaware of the chaos overhead. As the last two divers approached the line to retrieve their strobe lights, they saw a third strobe affixed to the line. One of the divers looked closely at the left-behind strobe and said it had the initials of TCP on it, saying it could only belong to one of two people on the John Jack, both of which had been up the line before him. He then got really nervous. The diver progressed through the necessary decompression stops, aware that whoever left the strobe on the line may have been lost in the wreck. More than an hour after Pritchard went missing, the diver finally emerged and reported seeing a strobe with his initials clipped to the line. By then, the search of the surface, based on Martzel's account of seeing Pritchard just below the boat, was already well underway. If Martzel had instead seen Sweeney, who surfaced several minutes before him, then Pritchard may have never left the Doria. Being on a rebreather, this guy could still be alive and just caught in a net, said one of the divers who asked to go down to search for Pritchard. 3 of the divers on the boat said that the 2 boat captains, owner Rich Benevento and Mark Alexander, declined to allow anyone back into the water to search for Pritchard at the wreck. Benevento, as well as Alexander, have never made a public comment on the incident, but some experienced divers and a Coast Guard official said the decision to keep everyone on board that day, while difficult, was the right decision. A couple hours after Pritchard vanished, the John Jack left the scene a day ahead of schedule and headed for port. About 40 hours after the Coast Guard arrived, the search was called off. If Pritchard ever surfaced, nobody saw him. What precisely happened that day may never be known for sure, but it is likely that he got trapped in the wreckage while on his 15-minute exploration and drowned. Whether an equipment failure or a medical emergency incapacitated him in the wreck, or something else entirely, the array of diving dangers can seem as vast as the sea itself. If he never left the Doria, a diver may one day discover him on another expedition. But for now, somewhere near the Andrea Doria, Tom Pritchard is buried far below the waves. Tom joined the list of 15 others who had perished while diving at the Doria, and was not the last, as several others have died since, bringing the total to 18 divers. This wreck is at extreme depths and posed dangers like lack of light, time constraint, and tight passages when entering the wreckage. An experienced charter boat captain of the wreck had this to say about the Doria. "It's not really any more dangerous than any other wreck, it's just an object, laying at the bottom of the ocean. But it's what you do at the wreck that gets you in trouble. Like any other dive, regardless of depth or location, it's dangerous." In closing, we would like to say rest in peace to Tom Pritchard. From what we've seen online, he seemed like a wonderful father, husband, and son. May his family know that his story will live on. That is the story of Tom Pritchard and the Andrea Doria. If you want to hear more scary, fascinating stories, make sure to check out last week's video.